Now let's compare the two, the camera and the eye, and how they see the light, and maybe we can see some commonalities. Okay? Here I've already diagrammed our eye from our previous lecture and our camera from the one after that. Okay? If we remember the way the path, if we understand the path of light through this, here's our light source and our light coming off. And light bounces off of our subject, being scattered in all different directions. Now remember, as light enters the eye, the first thing that it hits is the pupil. Okay? And what was the pupil's job? The pupil's job was to open and close to allow an amount of light. Okay? Well, what on the digital camera did that for us? You're right, it's the aperture. We can open and close that aperture to allow the correct amount of light entering the camera. After the pupil, light hit our lens, correct? Well, our lens is placed right before our pupil, but it does the same job. It bends and focuses light onto the sensor. Okay? After that, light will then hit the retina. And this is really the first time that we start to see with our human eye. Well, if we take that over to our camera, that is our sensor. Our sensor is the first time that we really get to see inside of the camera. Okay? And the last thing, I asked you to remember the eyelids on our eye. And if you can put your hand in front of your face and blink really fast. And what you're doing is capturing little images of your hand passing in front of your face. So our eyelid can act just like our shutter in our digital camera. Okay? So that's how we can compare the human eye into a digital camera. Is we have the same kind of parts in our eye as we do inside of the camera. Okay? Let's put some more meaning behind these terms. Here we have the four basic parts of a digital camera that we've outlined. Okay? We identified the lens, the aperture, the shutter, and the sensor. As a photographer, it is important to know these because this is where we really get to start controlling light entering the camera. Remember, the digital camera is a tool that we as photographers get to use to our advantage. We can control all four of these, but these three in particular on the way our digital camera sees light. Let's define these. Okay? Remember from our discussion earlier, the lens helps us bends and focuses light. Onto the sensor. Okay? Remember, a characteristic of light is it's going to bounce and scatter off of whatever object it's lighting. So we need the lens to control that, to focus our light. Okay? On a digital camera, the lens is measured by focal length. Right behind the lens, we have the aperture. And a good definition for aperture would be the aperture controls how much light enters the camera. Now I've underlined how much because the definition for aperture and shutter are going to be very similar. But when you think about aperture, think about it as a value to how much light is entering the camera. And that value is called f-stops. And this is normally identified by an F and then a number. Okay. A good definition for shutter will be how long light will enter the camera. And a good thing to remember about this is a time measurement, usually in the fractions of a second. Okay? So the shutter really controls how long light will enter the camera. And shutter is measured by shutter speeds. Okay. We can have it as quick as 1/4000th of a second. We can set it up to be a 2-second exposure. Or we can manually hold down that shutter to produce images such as pointing your camera up to the North Star and capturing the rotation of the Earth. Someone had to manually hold that shutter open while that happened. Okay. And the last definition is just like our retina on our eye. The sensor sees the image. And with the sensor, we can measure how our sensor sees light by a term . We can measure that in terms of ISO. Okay. Back in the film days, little side tidbit, back in the film days, this was known as film speed. But once we made that conversion over to digital photography, we just stayed with the number, which was an ISO number or an International Standard Organization number. Okay. And for most DSLR cameras, you can have an ISO range from 100 to 3200. Now again, as photographers, it's important for us to know these because this is how we control how light is entering our camera. In our next discussion about the exposure triangle, we will be talking about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So become very familiar with these terms.